My daughter's boyfriend showed up to Christmas dinner with a folder of legal documents demanding I sign over the cottage. And when I looked up from the papers, I caught my daughter sliding a note across the tablecloth toward my hand. Dad. He's been lying to us both. Don't sign anything. I set the folder down, picked up my wine glass, took one slow sip, and said 3 words that made the color drain from his face completely. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is James Whitfield. I'm 67 years old, and for the past 32 years I worked as a senior fraud investigator with the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada. I've reviewed thousands of cases. Mortgage fraud, elder financial abuse, investment scams, inheritance schemes. I know how these things are built. I know the language they use, the documents they fake, the pressure they apply. When I retired 3 years ago to my property outside Kelowna, I told myself I was done with all of it. The lake was right there. The garden needed attention. My knees needed rest. Then my daughter brought home the man she planned to marry. Her name is Abigail. She's 33, a physiotherapist in Vancouver. Sharp and kind in equal measure. She'd been seeing this man, I'll call him by his name, Reston, for about 9 months before I met him. Reston Hale, 40 years old, salt and pepper stubble, the kind of easy confidence that reads as warmth until you look a little closer. He worked in what he called private real estate development, which in my experience can mean many things, and most of them aren't good. But Abigail was happy. Genuinely, visibly happy. After a difficult few years, a broken engagement, a move across provinces, grinding hours building her practice, she was smiling again. I wasn't going to cast a shadow over that without a reason. He came to Kelowna that December with her, and I hosted them for Christmas. My late wife's sister came too, and the house was full in a way it hadn't been since we lost Marion 6 years ago. Everything felt almost normal, almost right. Reston was helpful in the kitchen, charming at dinner, good at asking questions, and even better at deflecting them. He never quite answered anything directly. I noticed that. I told myself I was being an overprotective father. On the second evening, after Christmas dinner, Reston leaned back in his chair, set down his wine, and produced a manila folder from the bag he'd brought inside from the car. He placed it on the table between us with the careful deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this moment. He said he had a business proposition he'd been wanting to discuss. My daughter's expression shifted. Something passed across her face. Not excitement, not curiosity. Something closer to held breath. The folder contained a 12-page document, a joint venture agreement, professionally typeset, with the logo of a numbered company I didn't recognize at the top. The proposal, as Reston explained it with the calm cadence of someone presenting a quarterly report, was this. The lakefront cottage my wife and I had owned for 22 years was sitting on what he called significantly underutilized land. He had development contacts who were interested in the property. If I transferred part ownership of the lot into a joint venture with his company, they would manage the development, split the profits, and everyone would benefit. The paperwork was all there, he said. Just needed a signature. I said nothing for a long moment. I looked at my daughter. She was holding her wine glass with both hands, and she was not looking at Reston. She was looking at the tablecloth. Her jaw was tight in the way it gets when she's working very hard not to say something. Is there a problem with how I've described it? I asked, keeping my voice level. Reston smiled. Not at all. I just wanted to present it properly. The details are all in the agreement. We can have your solicitor look at it. Of course. That of course. The way it came out, smooth, rehearsed, meant to sound reassuring, told me a great deal. I told him I'd need some time to review it. He said of course, there was no rush, take all the time I needed. And then he refilled his own wine glass and changed the subject. Later that night, after Reston had gone to bed, Abigail knocked on the door of my study. She didn't sit down. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and she looked like she'd been carrying something very heavy for several months. She said, Dad, there are things about him I need to tell you, and I need you to listen without stopping me. I listened. It started, she said. Around the third month they were together. Small things at first. He'd mentioned that a deal had gone sideways and he was short on cash until the end of the quarter. Could she cover dinner this month? She did. Then his car needed work. Something with the transmission. He'd said $1,400. He'd pay her back the moment this particular sale closed. She covered it. Then there was a permit issue with a development project in the Okanagan. His investors were solid, but the cash flow timing was awkward. Could she loan him $12,000 just for 6 weeks? She covered that too. She hadn't told me. She'd been afraid I'd judge her. By the time I was hearing this, Reston had borrowed, and that word became more complicated the longer she talked. A total of just under $40,000 from my daughter over 9 months. There was always a reason, there was always a deadline, there was always a very specific number, and a very specific date by which he'd return it. The dates came and went. The explanations multiplied. Then she found the folder on his laptop. Not that night, 3 weeks before Christmas. She'd been using his computer to minimize, and she saw an open file. She hesitated. Then she opened it. It was a spreadsheet, 3 columns. Name, amount, status. There were 8 rows. Her name was the 6th. Some of the status said settled, 2 said pending. Hers said in progress. She'd photographed it with her phone before closing the window and saying nothing. She hadn't said anything for 3 weeks. She'd been trying to decide what it meant, or maybe trying to decide what she wanted it to mean. She'd agreed to come to Kelowna for Christmas, because she thought that if I saw him, I would see what she was starting to see. She'd brought him here, hoping I would tell her she was wrong. She said, "I wrote you that note because I needed someone else to know. I needed it to be real." I asked her how many times she'd asked for the money back. She said 5 times. He always had an answer. He always had a reason. Once he'd gotten tearful and said he was under more pressure than he'd ever been in his life, and she'd ended up comforting him. I asked if she still loved him. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I love who I thought he was." I poured her a small glass of the scotch I keep in the bottom drawer and told her to sit down. I told her that what she had found on that laptop was not a coincidence and not a misunderstanding. I told her that the pattern she had described, specific amounts, specific dates that never materialized, escalating requests, emotional deflection when questioned, had a name. I'd spent 3 decades naming it in official reports. I also told her that the joint venture folder on my table was not a real proposal. It was a mechanism. The numbered company would be unregistered or recently incorporated. The development contacts would be vague or non-existent. The agreement would be structured so that I was the one absorbing the risk while providing access to an asset. And the asset, the cottage that Marion and I built, would become leverage. Abigail asked me what we were going to do, I said. First, we let him sleep. Then we find out who he actually is. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my desk with my laptop and started with what I had. A full name, a numbered company, and a city of operation. I still had access to some professional databases through my consulting work, and what I couldn't access directly I knew how to find through public filings. By 4 in the morning I had a picture that was considerably clearer than the one Reston had painted at the dinner table. The numbered company, 1187432 Ontario Inc., had been registered 18 months ago. No assets on record. No permits filed. 1 director, Reston Hale. It had opened a business bank account and done nothing else that I could verify. I found 2 civil court records in Ontario, both small claims, both within the past 4 years. One from a woman in Mississauga, a loan of $8,000 that was never repaid. Judgment entered against a Reston Hale at the same address. One from a business partner in Hamilton. $15,000, same result. I called a former colleague in the morning, before Reston was awake. She was still working, specialized in financial consumer protection enforcement, and when I told her the name and the company number, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "James, we've had a file open on this one for 7 months. We've been waiting for a complainant willing to go on record." By the time Reston came downstairs for coffee, I had a full picture. I had documentation, and I had the phone number of an RCMP financial crimes officer in the Lower Mainland who my colleague had already spoken to that morning. I sat at the kitchen table reading the newspaper, or appearing to. Reston poured himself coffee and asked pleasantly whether I'd had a chance to look at documents. I folded the newspaper. I looked at him. Then I said the three words, "I know everything." He held his mug for a moment without drinking from it. His expression moved through several phases very quickly. A brief recalibration, then the smile again, then a version of confusion that was several degrees too deliberate. He said, "I'm not sure what you mean, James," I said. "That's the second thing. I know that you'd say that." I laid out what I had found on the table between us. Not everything, just enough. The numbered company with no activity. The 2 civil judgments. The spreadsheet my daughter had photographed on his laptop, which I'd printed out at 2 in the morning. The name of the woman in Mississauga, who my colleague had already spoken to, and who had agreed to provide a statement. Reston's hand, which had been resting flat on the table, curled slowly inward. He started to speak. I let him get about 2 sentences in. Something about misunderstandings, about context, about how things looked on paper versus how they actually were. And then I stopped him. I told him I had spent 32 years listening to people explain how things that looked like fraud were actually something else. I told him I had a particular sensitivity to that particular explanation. I told him that in approximately 2 hours, my daughter and I had an appointment at the local RCMP detachment in Kelowna, and that whether or not he was present for that appointment was entirely his choice. Abigail had come downstairs during this. She was standing in the doorway. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Reston looked at her. Something changed in his face. Not remorse, exactly. More like the moment a card player realizes the other person has seen their hand. He set his coffee mug down very carefully, pushed his chair back, and went upstairs. 20 minutes later, he came down with his bag. He said he thought it would be better if he drove back to Vancouver. I said I thought so too. He left without another word. The door closed. We listened to his car start and pull down the gravel driveway. Abigail sat down at the table where he'd been sitting. She put her head in her hands, not crying, just very still. I made us both breakfast. We went to the RCMP detachment that afternoon. The officer we met with, a patient, thorough woman in her 40s, listened for 90 minutes and asked questions that told me she already knew a great deal of the background. She took copies of everything I'd brought, including the spreadsheet photograph. She said they would be in touch. The following week, I filed a formal complaint with the Financial Consumer Agency on behalf of my daughter. I also helped her write the small claims court application for the $40,000. It wasn't a sure outcome, but it was a record. It was real, on paper, with dates and amounts. I also contacted the woman from Mississauga myself. She was in her late 50s, recently widowed, and when I explained why I was calling, she went very quiet. Then she said she had tried to report it at the time and felt like no one had taken it seriously. She said she'd be happy to put anything she had in writing. The second complainant from Hamilton was harder to reach, but my colleague tracked him down through a mutual professional contact. He'd written off the $15,000 as a bad business lesson. When he heard there were now multiple complainants, including a formal RCMP file, he reconsidered. Reston, for his part, made the mistake that people in his position often make. He sent my daughter a series of text messages over the following 2 weeks. The first few were conciliatory. He'd been under stress. He'd made poor choices. He hoped she could understand. Then, when she didn't respond, they shifted. He said he had texts from her, agreeing to all of the loans as gifts. He said he'd kept records. He said that if she pursued this, it would complicate things for her professionally. My daughter forwarded every message to me the moment it arrived. I forwarded every message to the RCMP officer. The RCMP officer called me 11 days after our appointment. She said the messages Reston had sent constituted an attempt to intimidate a complainant, and combined with the documentation from 3 complainants and the existing file, They had sufficient grounds to lay charges. Fraud over $5,000 under Section 380 of the Criminal Code of Canada's 2 counts, possibly a third, depending on how the Hamilton complaint was assessed. He was arrested on a Thursday. My daughter called me when she got the notification from the Crown's office. She was at her clinic, between patients. I could hear the noise of the waiting room behind her voice. She said, "Is it actually done?" I said, "The arrest is done. The court process takes longer. But yes, the part where he gets to keep doing this to people is done." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I keep thinking about the other names on that spreadsheet, the ones Mark settled." I told her so did I. I told her the RCMP was working on it. The case moved through the court system over the following months. Reston entered a not guilty plea initially, which was predictable. His lawyer, a second-tier defense attorney out of Burnaby, tried to reframe the loans as consensual personal arrangements between adults in a relationship. The Crown prosecutor, a meticulous young man from the BC Prosecution Service, laid out the pattern evidence methodically. The civil judgments, the numbered company with no activity, the spreadsheet, the intimidation texts, the victim statements. The judge, at the sentencing hearing, called the behavior calculated and predatory, and noted that the defendant had shown no genuine remorse at any point in the proceedings. Reston received 14 months in federal custody and was ordered to pay restitution to all 3 complainants in the total amount of $63,000. His ability to actually pay that was limited, but the order was real, it was on record, and it followed him. My daughter got most of her $40,000 back through a combination of the restitution order and the small claims judgment we'd also pursued in parallel set. Not every dollar, but most. The night the sentencing came down, Abigail drove up to Kelowna. We sat on the back porch with the lake in front of us, and it was cold enough that we needed blankets, and I made tea because she doesn't drink much and I'd had enough whiskey over the past several months to last me. She asked me when I'd known. At dinner, I said, before the note. But the note told me she knew too. She said she'd spent weeks telling herself she was being paranoid, that she was too suspicious, that she'd been burned before and was projecting. I told her the thing I'd learned in 32 years of looking at fraud cases. The instinct that something is wrong is almost always correct. What people spend years second-guessing is not the instinct, but the courage to act on it. She said, "I should have said something soon." I told her she said it exactly when she needed to. The cottage is still here. The lake freezes over in January and thaws in April, and the dock needs a couple of new planks this spring, and the garden is already planning itself in ways I'll have to negotiate with. Marion planted the lilac hedge along the east side, and it comes back every year without being asked. Some things hold. Abigail is doing well. She has more patience than she can take, and a waiting list she doesn't know what to do with. And she's started hiking again, which she'd let go of somewhere in the middle of all of it. She came up last month, and we walked the ridge trail above the orchard, and she talked about a colleague at her clinic. The way people talk when they're trying not to make a big deal of something that is quietly a big deal. I didn't say anything about it. I just listened. That's most of what a father can do, in the end. Show up when the note slides across the table. Pay attention to what your instincts are telling you. Know when to say, "I know everything," and mean it. And make sure the cottage stays in the family.